So between my other videos, I've been working on a larger one comparing Baldur's Gate 3 to Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, which means I spent a lot of time with my head shoved into the fantasy genre. Granted, my head has never not been in the fantasy genre. I used to play D&D fairly often before 5th edition ruined it, and I've been playing World of Warcraft from its release up until now with only brief months of unsubscribing in between, and I've also always just been a big classic CRPG bitch. And in having to tread that ground again for the big Baldur's Gate video, I'm left with one question. Why are humans so frequently the worst race in any fantasy game? Fantasy races are pretty much the lifeblood of fantasy games, as the ability to insert yourself into a fantastical world of wonder involves being able to insert yourself into a culture that lives in that world. But fantasy games have long struggled with the big three: humans, elves, and dwarves. Dwarves are usually the easiest ones. They live underground, they drink, they mine, they might be made of rocks, and they're all Scottish, except in Dragon Age where they're all American and have a really intricate bureaucracy. Elves have only two modes. In Lord of the Rings, they're otherworldly creatures who are so long-lived that they have surpassed literally everything else on the planet, and so they all leave to go do something else. And then in every other piece of fantasy media, they're minoritized and subject to genocide upon genocide because Lord of the Rings tweaked the worst kind of fantasy bitch. And then you have the humans, who are nothing. If there's ever been one constant throughout the fantasy genre, it's that humans are simultaneously omnipresent, the most powerful and widespread race in the land, and they're also an underdeveloped culturalist vacuum who are at best defined by mercantilism and at worst defined by racism. I started thinking about this when me and my wife were talking about the cultural inspiration for races in World of Warcraft, and when she asked me what the humans were based on and how that influenced gameplay, I didn't really have an answer for her. World of Warcraft is probably the worst offender for how bad fantasy is at making humans interesting. Oh sure, there have been plenty of human characters all over the story, but they're all lone wolves. Human-run organizations tend to be militant and aggressive, especially when it comes to a culture or race they look down on, which is all of them. Human aggression is the primary reason for most of the Horde's members joining the Horde in the first place. But WoW's writing is weird. You know, over the years, writers have gotten really into the idea of the Alliance as the friend-making peacemongers, but they don't so much dial back Alliance aggression as they do make excuses for it. Throughout the story, human aggression is often completely forgotten about when the writers want their precious Uru baby boy to play peacemonger. For example, Garrosh is often blamed for fomenting war in Cataclysm, but that war was started an expansion prior by Varian Rin, who attempted to murder both Thrall and Sylvanas for crimes they didn't commit. Several expansions later, Sylvanas is given an entire villain arc surrounding the Fourth War, when that war was started by Genn attempting to murder the Horde's war chief for a crime she didn't commit, and also Kalia Menethil completely sabotaging a genuine attempt at mending that bridge at the Gathering in the following novel. In both these cases, the Horde's war chief is given the villain arc for a war the Alliance started. Blizzard's writers have no idea what they want the humans to be and just slap very generic concepts onto them. They're either generically good or they're clansmen. All of the examples I've shown tend to have no idea what their culture is, but WoW's humans exist in a complete cultureless void. D&D isn't as egregious with humans, but humans often have such little identity that players who make humans have to do triple the work to make their characters interesting because they can't just fall back on, lol, I'm a faith hippo named Bardy McBardfaith. And that's because for much of the game's lifespan, the humans were the race you played when you wanted to ignore most of the game's mechanics. They're good at everything, can master everything, and have no restricted classes. Humans are the ultimate blank slate, a race that has nothing to them. And this is weird because, have you seen humans in real life? There's tons of culture everywhere. Where the hell is all that culture that exists on planet Earth? Well, it's in the other races. Most fantasy stories tend to take real-life examples of human culture and bolt them onto fantasy races, often with no rhyme or reason. In Dragon Age and Dungeons & Dragons, the elves have Celtic and Norse inspirations in their culture. In World of Warcraft, the Night Elves are a mixture of Japan and ancient Rome, while the Blood Elves are a mixture of China and Saudi Arabia, of all places. Warcraft is so committed to this idea, they've done 2 different Moses allegories. They've made the non-human races of Azeroth a cultural smorgasbord. But what's left for the humans? Well, you have half Britain, half America fantasy default for Stormwind, you have comedy cockney British for the Gilneans, and you have pirates, which are just another flavor of British. Isn't it weird that so many cultures on Earth get reserved for the non-humans, and then there's nothing left for the actual humans? I wonder if there's a reason for, it's racism, isn't it, CD? Surprisingly, no. Racism is actually the grandfather to this issue, not the father. Okay, you don't need me to tell you that the default for humans in fantasy games is white people. But why does white people end up translating to the UK with all of the UK's stuff stripped out? I mean, England has a culture. It's got a pompous, stuck-up nobility. It's got a very distinct approach to monarchy. Its government is quite unique compared to other constitutional monarchies, and it's got just the most beautifully horrible food. I mean, what the fuck is this shit? Be honest with me, can you tell me one holiday in Ferelden, or Stormwind, or Baldur's Gate? And don't say the Wicker Man Festival, they stole that from the Forsaken. Even defenders of humans in D&D still call them basic, but why do they have to be basic? Well, It's because British is a culture and white is not. Stop. I can hear you angrily typing. Hear me out. Here's a question for you. What counts as white? Well, the answer has always been, it depends on who you are angry at. White people have changed the definition of who is and isn't white depending on who they're more angry about. A long time ago, being Irish or Italian was a mark for extreme discrimination in the United States, a country settled predominantly by the British, until they went all in on anti-Semitism and anti-African racism. The definition of whiteness expands and contracts whenever it's convenient for those in power. The concept of whiteness, and by extension non-whiteness, is a construct created by oppressors to make people who have a distinct cultural identity abandon it in favor of a culturalist vacuum, so that they can direct them at whatever enemy they see fit. Because someone with a distinct cultural identity may have loyalties that make them inconvenient to those in power. A lot of white people don't really have a culture of their own, in spite of the fact that their family may come from England, Ireland, Scotland, just basically all over Europe. Every single country in Europe has its own very distinct and identifiable culture. But white people, on a conceptual level, well, their culture is just kind of a melting pot of Europe, Africa, indigenous people, and East Asia that makes up most of North America. The fear of ethnic minorities is about the only consistent culture white people have ever had, because what they actually are has been slowly worn away to fit into the concept of whiteness. And this isn't something old that's still having its effects, it's still in practice today. Look at how much of Gen Z slang can be summed up as AAVE but used completely wrong. Hell, they say Gen Z slang, but my generation started that shit. So when you sit down and make humans in a fantasy world, they end up being white, and therefore devoid of culture, because other cultures are something else. They become the basic default blank slate. Not limited in their eyes by culture, they can be whatever they want and do whatever they want because other cultures are inferior in their eyes. Outside of World of Warcraft, humans are usually exempt from the race-class restrictions that give RPGs flavor. This is also the reason why some fantasy nerds get such a bug up their ass whenever elves are portrayed as objectively better than humans, to the point many fantasy series make them shorter than humans and physically frail. You can't be better than me because you're something else. Warcraft is the only one that bucks that particular trend, and it's wonderful for it. Despite their presence, humans there actually have a massive inferiority complex because there isn't a single class they can be where they are the quintessential example of that class. And the lack of culture is a big contributing factor to that. Many races have classes baked into their DNA on a cultural level. I know you think humans are the quintessential paladins, but there is a race that literally has the light fused into their very blood, and another that lives around the most powerful concentration of light energy on the planet. Any presence of a real culture for the humans would make them less of a blank slate. They would be something else. Even in Warcraft, when they leaned fully into the British origins or even the British Navy, they had to make them completely separate races because the ones that get to be called humans just can't be anything. They're not allowed to be because you aren't allowed to be. If they had a culture, they would be something else. This approach to culture affects more than just the world building. Many fantasy stories tend to have what I often call the elf paradox, where the story is almost unilaterally focused on how arrogant the ancient elves were, how they hated outsiders, how they thought they were better than everyone, and they might have done slavery. And then you look at the humans in the present day, and they are all of those things right in front of you, constantly. Dragon Age is especially bad about this. Here's a brief recap of Dragon Age lore. Mages are oppressed by humans because they might go insane. Elves are oppressed by humans because they might be dangerous. Kunari are feared by humans because they could be violent and warmongering. And humans are insane, dangerous, violent, and warmongering. You're shown the way elves are treated as second-class citizens and living in ghettos, and how they used to be enslaved. If you play an elf, the first exposure you get to humans is being kidnapped for an Arl Sun's rape party. Mages get it even worse as they're all rounded up into concentration camps for pretty much no reason other than the fact that Ferelden and Orlais used to be part of the Tevinter, which is a magocracy. But the game really wants you to pretend that this is some kind of gray area by showing you, look, the mages are out of control because all the abuse we do to them. Look, the ancient elves were kind of rude and arrogant, so they deserve to genocide, slavery, and to live in ghettos. Meanwhile, you could track the date in Dragon Age by which holocaust the humans are committing in a given moment. This wouldn't necessarily be a problem, except for the fact that the series is constantly looking away and saying, oh my god, look at all these Darkspawn, look at that dragon, look at that elven god itching to be a dictator. You get told about the bad things the elves did in the past, or that Kunari did somewhere else, but you get to see with your own eyes the sheer layers of fucked up depravity the humans engage in every 5 fucking seconds. Despite setting up a number of very good hooks for an antagonist, the series never uses it, because the crimes against the elves and mages have to do with things that are systemically wrong with human kingdoms at their core. Their entire way of life is built on oppression, and no human character is exempt from that kind of guilt. It would make playing a human noble an automatic evil playthrough, because you can't do anything substantial to aid either oppressed group in Ferelden. It would hang a lampshade on the fact that one of your specializations is quite literally Nazi. And given that the Chantry is responsible for most of this, it would be really hard to put the Chantry in any kind of heroic role. And they like putting the Chantry in heroic roles. Things just get really uncomfortable for the demographic that is most likely to buy your game, because if you start looking at systemic problems in Thedas, you notice a lot of parallels to white supremacy, which not every white person is guilty of, but every white person benefits from. So instead, the series ignores it. It directs your attention away from it to quickly focus on other things. It does everything it can to make one-sided oppression into something more complicated than it actually is. And if you don't treat all of this like a morally gray issue, the game and its fans get upset with you. Warcraft isn't any better. As fun as it is that the humans get a supreme inferiority complex, it also does Dragon Age's problem of having the humans be hyper-violent, hyper-aggressive racism factories, where half their characters are wearing fascist cosplay and chanting about how they're the Light's Chosen, here to purge the savages. But the game would really rather you focus on literally anything else. When humans do fucked up shit, it gets either walked back or ignored. When anyone else does it, it leaves reverberations throughout the story. A lot of Alliance players can't comprehend why the Blood Elves joined the Horde and stayed there, to the point of calling it narratively absurd, and have been demanding for High Elves to be a playable race for the Alliance. But the answer is because the Alliance has tried to wipe them out multiple times. Grand Marshal Garithos attempted to finish the job Arthas started, and he was leading the Alliance forces in Lordaeron. Moving into TBC, the Alliance sent spies under the guise of diplomacy, while the Night Elves were attempted to disable the Ward Stones that were keeping the Scourge out of Eversong Woods. And then in Mists of Pandaria, when they briefly considered escaping Hellscream by joining the Alliance, Jaina went on a fucking massacre of Blood Elf civilians in Dalaran. Hell, the faction wars which played a major role in Cataclysm, Mists of Pandaria, and Battle for Azeroth were both started by the Alliance, but you don't remember that because burn it! The story doesn't hang on these things nearly as much as it does something like Teldrassil, the Wrathgate, or Theramore. So a lot of players just don't know these things, and God help you if you get your WoW lore from YouTubers. Most of them are Alliance mains who downplay these things or omit them entirely. In both of these cases, human crimes, despite being systemic and very obviously approved of by those in power, are treated as lone wolf crimes because otherwise they'd have to ask unfortunate questions about the way these cultures operate, and they just don't have a culture at all, so there's nothing for them to pivot to. Without their weird quasi-Christian imperialism, they have nothing. This isn't an attempt to make you feel bad for playing humans in RPGs. Quite the opposite, in fact. I am trying to make you angry about the fact that humans are so often omnipresent in fantasy stories, yet they're as dry as Ben Shapiro's wife. Even when they commit unspeakable acts of unforgivable evil, they don't even get to have the fun of being the over-the-top bad guy. Fuck me, no wonder Human Fighter gets memed on for being basic in D&D. It's nothing. You get nothing fun to play with. And the only reason you don't get anything fun to play with is because of some idea that you need to be the default. The empty void of a template on which other races get to deviate from in interesting and fun ways. And if that doesn't piss you off, it really fucking should, because you would be having way more fun if they didn't do it like this.